No matter how hard you try, you can't stop us now. No matter how hard you try, you can't stop us now.
Welcome back to Truth Radio. Sean, my last broadcast with you guys here. And I prepared a little address to the listeners, the nation, anyone who cares about the fate of our country. Guys, we're broke. On June 5th, 1933, Franklin Delano Roosevelt signed into law the Emergency Banking Act, which declared America bankrupt and insolvent. 20 years after the 1913 Federal Reserve Act authorized a private central bank to loan money to the government at interest, the country declared its bankruptcy. 20 years after the Federal Reserve Act was passed, Congress enacted House Joint Resolution 192 to, quote, suspend the gold standard and abrogate the gold clause, and the nation became insolvent. Just 20 years after the Federal Reserve Act became law, gold at $20 an ounce was inflated by FDR to $29 an ounce, confiscated with the passing of the Gold Reserve Act in 1934, and then inflated again to $35 an ounce. And almost 100 years after the passing of the Federal Reserve Act, gold is still around, well, $1,200 an ounce, and the US dollar has lost over 95% of its purchasing power. That should tell us something. What it tells us is that it is physically impossible to eliminate our national debt. Impossible. In the literal sense. We have money backed by nothing but debt. We have a monetary system where the government says to a central bank, a private central bank, can we have some money? And the private central bank says, sure, here's some paper that says some money on it. We owe that money and interest back to the private central bank. And the only way to give them that interest is to increase the money supply by borrowing more from the same central bank at interest. To eliminate the debt would be to eliminate our money supply. I'm sorry if you already know this, but it is still very widespread belief that our money is backed by gold. Most people say, but isn't our money backed by the gold in Fort Knox? The fact is that we have no idea what is in Fort Knox, because it has not been privately audited since the days of Eisenhower. And there is supposedly $137 billion of gold in the vaults. As if that could fix our debt woes, to which $4 billion is added every day. A debt in the trillions of dollars. The fact is that the Federal Reserve has never been audited. Ever. In its near 100-year existence, the Federal Reserve, which is neither federal nor contains reserves, has never been subject to an audit. And recently passed legislation to do so under the Dodd-Frank bill was nothing more than a watered-down version of H.R. 1207, which would have conducted a complete and independent audit of the private central bank. It failed to pass both houses, and the so-called audit that was passed will only provide an audit of the recently mismanaged $2 trillion. And yet we don't talk about this. We just argue for lower taxes for the poor and higher taxes for the rich and the middle class. We argue for tax credits while we miss the point that our entire money system is the reason for our current crisis. And without fixing it, all of the tax cuts and all the credits in the world won't be able to save us, because all of our income tax dollars goes directly to pay off the interest to the private central bank known as the Federal Reserve. In 1984, the President's Private Sector Survey on Cost Control released their findings to the public, stating, quote, with 2/3 of everyone's personal income taxes wasted or not collected, 100% of what is collected is absorbed solely by interest on the federal debt. and by federal government contributions to transfer payments. In other words, all individual income tax revenues are gone before 1 nickel is spent on the services which taxpayers expect from their government. End quote. That's right. 100% of our individual income tax goes directly to pay off the debt of a non-gold-backed currency borrowed from a private central bank that was unconstitutionally given the authority to print money and loan it to us at interest. What can we do to fix this? Well, in the long term, we have to return to a commodity-backed monetary system so we can physically and actually pay away our national debt. In the short term, we can do this by completely auditing the Federal Reserve, shutting it down, abolishing the individual income tax by repealing the 16th Amendment, and let the people, rich or poor, keep their wages that they make. Enough of this tax anyone making more than me nonsense. I mean, if I take a piano lesson once every few months from a teacher that charges $100 an hour, why does the federal government get to take a percentage of that teacher's earnings? That was an even exchange. An hour's pay for an hour's work. And if you think this is crazy, the Supreme Court stated, quote, "Income tax statutes apply only to state-created creatures known as corporations, no matter whether state, local, or federal." In the case Colonial Pipeline versus Tragle. Putting it even more clearly in the case Stapler versus the United States, the Supreme Court ruled, quote, "There is a clear distinction between profit and wages or compensation for labor. Compensation for labor cannot be regarded as profit within the meaning of the law. The word profit is a different thing altogether from mere compensation for labor." They stated, quote, "Income within the meaning of the 16th Amendment and Revenue Act means gains. And in such connection, gains means profit. Proceeding from property, severed from capital, however invested or employed and coming in, received or drawn by the taxpayer for his separate use, benefit, and disposal. Income is not a wage or compensation for any type of labor." Not to mention that any information that you divulge on your tax returns, whether they are 1040s or 1099s, can be used to prosecute you. Well, what happened to our Fifth Amendment rights against self-incrimination? What about all these U.S. Supreme Court rulings deeming that the income tax does not target individuals for their wages, which, by the way, have never been overturned? Well, to quote Sheldon Cohen, the former IRS commissioner and author of the IRS tax code, the U.S. Supreme Court rulings are inapplicable to this situation. I mean, he is on video saying that. No, sir, the U.S. Supreme Court is not inapplicable to the IRS. It's just that the IRS owns our government, and so the government plays along and arrests American citizens for not filing a tax return. And if you just so happen to piss off the government, they'll send the IRS after you. The IRS is without a doubt the biggest political weapon that our own government has against us. And as long as we have an income tax and an IRS, none of the American people who choose to speak out against the policies of the government are safe. For the federal government, to force you to track your income, your gifts, your tips, your wages, your exchange for an item sold, just so it can take a percentage of your even exchange. And is this freedom? What is less free than selling something or doing something for someone and charging them for it, and then being forced to give a percentage of that property to the government just so it can pay off the interest on a debt owed to an unconstitutional private central bank? This country became the wealthiest nation by 1905 with only a fraction of the population and resources of the world, and they did it without an income tax. We can do it again.
We're now at the point where a little girl with a lemonade stand now has to have her lemonade stand shut down so she can go to the State Department to file for a permit. Is this freedom?